Hi there, boys and girls. Tonight for story time, we're going to read Mr. Funny by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Funny lived in a teapot. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, and it suited Mr. Funny very nicely. Do you know anyone who lives in a teapot? That seems rather funny. One day Mr. Funny was having lunch. He wasn't very hungry, so he only had a daisy sandwich and a glass of toast. Delicious, he murmured to himself as he finished his funny lunch. Daisy sandwich. A glass of toast. After lunch, Mr. Funny decided to go for a drive in his car. Mr. Funny's car was a shoe. Have you ever seen a car that looked like a shoe? It looks very funny. As he drove along, everybody who saw him laughed at him because he was such a funny sight. He passed a worm by the side of the road. This worm thought Mr. Funny in his funny car was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He nearly laughed himself in two. Even the flowers Mr. Funny passed thought that he was the funniest thing that they had ever seen. They nearly laughed themselves out of the ground. Eventually, Mr. Funny came to an intersection. He didn't know which way to go, so he looked at the signs. One of the signs said, "To the zoo." That will be fun, thought Mr. Funny, so he drove his shoe to the zoo. Shoe, zoo. That's a rhyme. It sounds the same. When he arrived at the gate of the zoo, he stopped. It was closed. "I'm sorry," said the zookeeper. "The park's closed. We've had to close the zoo because all the animals have colds, and they're all feeling very sorry for themselves." "Oh dear," said Mr. Funny, and then he thought for a moment. "Perhaps I can help cheer them up," he said. "Well," said the zookeeper, "it's worth a try." And he opened the gate. "Sorry, folks, park's closed." Mr. Funny drove into the zoo in his shoe. The first thing he saw was an elephant. It was true. The elephant was feeling very sorry for herself. Very sorry indeed. Mr. Funny looked at the sad-looking elephant, and the sad-looking elephant looked at Mr. Funny. Oh dear. That elephant looks very sad indeed. Then, do you know what Mr. Funny did? He made a funny face. Mr. Funny, as you can imagine, is very good at making funny faces. The elephant giggled. She had never seen anything so funny. Mr. Funny made another funny face. The elephant burst out laughing. Do you know how to make funny faces? The elephant laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard, she nearly laughed her trunk off. And she felt a whole lot better. Mr. Funny went over to the lion's house. There was a lion, feeling very sorry for himself. Mr. Funny looked at the sad-looking lion, and the sad-looking lion looked at Mr. Funny. Oh dear. Very sad indeed. And then Mr. Funny made the funniest looking face that's probably ever been made anywhere, ever. Now you've heard of a lion roar before, haven't you? Well, this lion roared with laughter. He laughed so hard, he nearly laughed his whiskers to pieces. See if you can make your funniest face ever. Then Mr. Funny went around to see all the other animals in the zoo. Oh dear, what a miserable looking bunch. For all of them, Mr. Funny made funnier and funnier and funnier faces. The big brown bear giggled, then burst out laughing. The giraffe laughed so hard she nearly laughed her neck into a knot, and the hippopotamus nearly laughed himself out of his skin. The penguins nearly laughed their flippers floppy, and the leopard, well, you really should have seen him. He laughed so hard he nearly laughed his spots off. What craziness! Oh, Mr. Funny, giggled the zookeeper. Oh, Mr. Funny, thank you very much for coming to cheer us up. Oh, it was really nothing, replied Mr. Funny, modestly. Then Mr. Funny drove off in his shoe. Later, when Mr. Funny arrived home, he chuckled to himself. Well, he said, that's the end of another funny day. And he parked his shoe and went inside his teapot. And because he was feeling thirsty, he made himself a nice hot cup of cake. The end. Remember, this is Mr. Funny. He does things rather strangely, doesn't he? I hope you enjoyed the story. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.